Wyoming Territory, autumn 1888. The air was already a liar. It carried the scent of pine sap and sun-baked dust, a memory of summer that had no business lingering. But underneath, a different truth was gathering, a cold, sharp, metallic tang that spoke of deep iron wells and the high, merciless places where winter was born. Elara Vance felt it on her skin. At 19, she had become a reluctant expert in lies. She stood before the thing the town council called her inheritance. It was a line shack, a forgotten punctuation mark on a vast, empty page of prairie. Its timbers were silver gray with age and surrender. Its roof a patchwork of hope and rust. It leaned into the prevailing wind, as if tired of fighting a battle it had been losing for decades. This was not a home. It was a waiting room for the inevitable. Her parents had been taken by a fever that swept through the valley like a phantom, swift and silent. They had been good people, quiet people, who had saved their money for a real plot of land, a dream that now lay buried with them under the thin soil of the town cemetery. Their savings had been just enough to cover the cost of their coffins and 2 modest headstones. The rest, their tools, their wagon, their memory, had been auctioned off to settle debts Elara never knew they had. What was left was her. And the shack. The town's pity was a heavy blanket, offered with one hand while the other pushed her away. Mr. Silas Blackwood, owner of the lumber mill and the town's unassailable voice of reason, had been the one to deliver the verdict. He stood before the council, a man built of the same sturdy timber he sold, and declared her situation a problem of Christian charity. "The girl is alone," he had said, his voice a low rumble of authority. "She has no people, no trade. We cannot have her as a public charge." So, they gave her the shack. It sat on a parcel of land considered worthless, too exposed for crops, too far for water. It was an act of charity that felt remarkably like an execution. They were giving her just enough rope to hang herself, a place to fail quietly, out of sight and out of mind. She was a liability, a loose thread in the tight weave of their community, and they had snipped her clean. She knew what they whispered when she bought flour at the general store. "Poor thing. Won't see the spring. Blackwood says that shack's a tinderbox in a gale." Their pity was a currency she could not spend, a food that offered no nourishment. It was a blanket that smothered will. The central problem was the wind. It never stopped. It was a living entity out here, a restless spirit of the plains that scoured the land, stole the warmth from the soil, and screamed its loneliness into the vast, empty sky. The shack had been built without a thought for it, its single door facing west, a welcome mat for the gales that barreled down from the mountains. Winter was coming. Not just any winter. The old-timers, men who read the signs in the thickness of beaver pelts and the migration of geese, were all saying the same thing. This would be a winter of legend. A killer winter. Elara stood in the doorway of her waiting room and watched the sun bleed across the horizon. The beauty of it was a cruel joke. The cold was already seeping up through the soles of her worn boots. She had a small pile of firewood, a sack of flour, and a jar of her mother's preserved peaches. It was a meal, not a strategy. Desperation is a key. It unlocks rooms you never knew existed. That night, huddled under a thin blanket, the wind already beginning to groan around the corners of the shack, Elara opened the one thing she had managed to save from the auction: her father's old sea chest. He had not always been a farmer. Before he'd met her mother, before he'd chased a dream of land and sky, he had been a forester in the old country. He had grown up in a place of deep woods and ancient knowledge, a world away from this raw, exposed territory. The chest smelled of cedar and salt, and inside, beneath a set of his worn clothes, was a leather-bound journal. Its pages were filled with his tight, meticulous script, a mix of scientific observation and what felt like poetry. He hadn't written about farming. He had written about trees. He wrote of windbreaks in the windswept coastal plains of Germany, not as simple fences, but as living, breathing systems. He drew diagrams of airflow, of eddies and currents. He wrote of how a solid wall was a fool's defense against the wind, an act of arrogance that nature always punished. A solid wall, he wrote, creates a vacuum on its lee side, a void that pulls the wind down with even greater violence, scouring the ground and piling snow into impassable drifts. "Do not build a dam," one entry read. "Build a reef. A dam fights the water and will one day break. A reef lives with the current, gentles it, and creates a place of calm behind it." For 3 days, she did nothing but read. She neglected the firewood, ate cold biscuits, and consumed her father's words. He described specific species, the dense, interlocking branches of the Norway spruce, the deep-rooted tenacity of the ponderosa pine, the flexible strength of the blue spruce. He wrote about planting patterns, not in straight lines, but in staggered, layered, curving rows that would confuse the wind, break its momentum, and lift its main force high above the ground. He detailed how the snow, the great enemy, could be turned into an ally. A properly designed windbreak wouldn't just stop the wind, it would tell the snow where to fall. The heavy, wet flakes would be stripped from the air by the dense needles and fall among the trees, not against the house. The snow would build and build, creating a massive, insulating berm, a fortress of winter's own making, but one that protected rather than buried. A new feeling began to displace the cold dread in Alara's heart. It was a fragile, flickering thing, but it felt like a flame. It was the birth of an idea, a solution so unconventional, so contrary to every settler's logic, that it felt like madness. The people of the territory cleared trees. They saw them as obstacles, as fuel, as something to be conquered. The ideal homestead was a cabin in a wide, clear field, a testament to man's dominion over nature. Her father's journal proposed the exact opposite. It proposed a partnership. The next morning, she took a shovel and a burlap sack and walked towards the foothills, where the land offered a little shelter and the young evergreens grew thick and stubborn. The work was brutal. The ground was already hardening, fighting the bite of the shovel. She wasn't looking for tall, proud saplings, but for the young, dense, hardy ones her father had described, the survivors. She dug them out with painstaking care, preserving as much of the root ball as she could, her back and shoulders screaming in protest. She hauled them back to the shack, 2 at a time, their weight a punishing reassurance. Then came the planting. She didn't guess. She followed the diagrams in the journal, using twine and stakes to lay out a series of concentric, curving lines around the cabin. The outermost ring was the densest, a mix of blue spruce and ponderosa pine, planted so close they would one day touch. The next ring was staggered, creating gaps that would break up the wind without stopping it dead. The innermost ring, closest to the cabin, was the most sparse, designed to create the final pocket of calm her father had called the stille Raum, the quiet room. For weeks, this was her life. From dawn until her muscles gave out at dusk, she dug, hauled, and planted. Her hands became a raw landscape of blisters and cuts. She grew thin, her face smudged with dirt, her hair a wild tangle. The town noticed. A rider on his way to a distant ranch saw her and reported back that the Vance girl was digging holes all around her shack like a crazed badger. Another saw her dragging trees and swore she was building some kind of pagan fence. The narrative of the poor thing began to shift. Now she was the mad thing. The community's judgment, once a quiet whisper, was about to find its voice. And that voice belonged to Silas Blackwood. He arrived on a Saturday, mounted on a large, handsome gelding that seemed to disapprove of the landscape as much as its owner did. Blackwood was a man who believed in straight lines, right angles, and the unassailable logic of milled lumber. He saw the world as a problem to be solved with saws and hammers. He dismounted and surveyed the scene, his face a mask of profound disbelief. He saw not a home, but a disaster in progress. 100 scraggly, half-dead saplings stuck in the ground at random, surrounding a shack that was already on its last legs. "Miss Vance," he said. His voice was not unkind, but it was heavy with the certainty of his own wisdom. It was the voice of a man accustomed to being right. Alara stopped her digging, leaning on her shovel. She was covered in sweat and dirt, and she met his gaze without fear. "Mr. Blackwood." "May I ask what this is?" he asked, gesturing with a gloved hand at the chaotic array of young trees. "Some kind of garden?" "A wall," she said simply. He chuckled, a low, rumbling sound. "A wall? Daughter, these are twigs. The first real wind we get will snap them in half. You're wasting your strength." "They won't snap," she said. "They're meant to bend. They slow the wind. They don't fight it." Blackwood's expression hardened. He was no longer dealing with a grieving girl. He was dealing with a fool. And foolishness, in his experience, was dangerous. That's not how it works. You want to stop the wind, you build a solid wall. Thick logs, tight chinking. That's how a man stays warm in this country. "A solid wall makes the snow drift," she replied, her voice quiet but firm. She was quoting her father's journal. "It buries you." "Of course it makes the snow drift," he boomed, his patience fraying. "That's why you build strong and keep a shovel handy. What you're doing here, this is madness. You're inviting the drifts in. You're building your own tomb. These trees will catch every flake of snow and pile it right on top of your roof until it collapses. You'll be buried alive." He took a step closer, his tone shifting to one of paternalistic concern. It was, in its own way, more insulting than his scorn. "Listen to me, Alara. I've built more than 50 homesteads in this territory. I know what stands and what falls. This will fall. I will send a man out tomorrow with an axe. He'll clear this mess for you, free of charge. We'll get you a proper supply of firewood stacked against your north wall, and you can get through this winter with some dignity." The offer hung in the air between them. It was her last chance to be saved, to be brought back into the fold of conventional wisdom. It was her last chance to be the poor thing instead of the mad thing. "No, thank you, Mr. Blackwood," she said. "The trees stay." His face closed like a fist. He saw her not as defiant, but as broken. A mind cracked by grief. He shook his head slowly, a gesture of profound disappointment. "So be it," he said, turning back to his horse. "Don't say you weren't warned." He rode away without looking back. The verdict was now official. Silas Blackwood returned to town and announced to anyone who would listen that the Vance girl had lost her senses. She was planting her own graveyard. The community's opinion, solidified by his authority, completed her isolation. They no longer saw her as a problem to be solved, but as a tragedy foretold. They washed their hands of her. She was on her own, a solitary figure in a sea of prairie grass, surrounded by her ridiculous, hopeful, foolish little trees. The first snowflakes began to fall the following week. Before we see the storm that would change everything, we must pause. To understand what happened in the heart of that blizzard, you have to understand the profound difference between a fortress that fights the world and a shelter that understands it. You have to understand the physics of wind and snow and the simple, devastating arrogance of a straight line. Silas Blackwood was not a stupid man. He was a master of a certain kind of knowledge, the conventional knowledge. His method, the one used to build every home in the valley, was based on a simple principle: brute force. A cabin was a box. Its walls were thick, its roof was pitched to shed snow, and its stove was a hungry god demanding constant tribute. The enemy was the cold, and the strategy was to build an impenetrable barrier against it. But this strategy contained a fatal flaw, a deep misunderstanding of nature. When a powerful, sustained wind strikes a flat, solid wall, like the side of a log cabin, it cannot pass through. The air molecules pile up, creating a zone of high pressure. The wind, seeking the path of least resistance, accelerates violently as it flows up and over the roof and around the sides. This accelerated flow is called the Bernoulli principle. It's the same principle that allows an airplane's wing to generate lift. But for a cabin, it is a disaster. This river of fast-moving air acts like a siphon, literally pulling the precious warm air out of the cabin through every tiny crack, every seam in the chinking, every gap in the window frame. This is why in a blizzard, a well-built house feels so drafty. The house itself is creating the suction that draws the cold in. Worse still is what happens on the other side of the cabin, the leeward side. As the wind detaches from the roof and walls, it leaves behind a large area of very low pressure, a near vacuum. Nature abhors a vacuum. The wind curls back on itself, forming a powerful, swirling eddy. This eddy is a snow magnet. It is where the wind, suddenly slowing, dumps its load of suspended snow. This is why the largest, deepest snowdrifts always form directly behind a building or a solid fence. Blackwood's cabins were designed, by their very nature, to bury themselves. His solution, the shovel, was a response to a problem of his own creation. His fortress was a siege engine aimed at itself. Now, consider Alara's folly. Her father's wisdom was not about brute force. It was about fluid dynamics. He understood that a living wall of trees was not a solid barrier, but a porous filter. The outermost, densest ring of trees didn't stop the wind, it engaged it. As the wind hit the millions of needles and flexible branches, its smooth, laminar flow was shattered into thousands of tiny, chaotic eddies. Its energy was diffused. Its momentum was broken. This turbulent, slowed air then encountered the second, staggered ring of trees. This layer acted like a sieve, further calming the air and, most critically, beginning to lift the main body of the wind. By the time the air reached the innermost ring of trees, the ferocious ground-level gale had been transformed into a gentle, swirling breeze. The main force of the storm was now passing harmlessly 20 feet above the cabin's roof. She hadn't built a dam. She had built a reef, and her tiny cabin rested in the quiet lagoon behind it. The effect on the snow was even more profound. As the wind was slowed by the outer ring, it lost its capacity to carry its heavy load of snow. The flakes were no longer driven horizontally. They fell, gently, vertically. They were caught by the dense branches of the spruce and fir, clinging to the needles. The snow accumulated not against the cabin, but within the forest itself. As the storm raged, a massive, cohesive dome of snow began to form, burying the trees, its smooth, aerodynamic shape helping to lift the wind even more effectively. The trees provided the structure, and the snow provided the mass. It was a self-constructing igloo, a natural insulation barrier dozens of feet thick. Silas Blackwood's cabin was a weapon designed to fight a war. Alara Vance's cabin was a conversation. He shouted at the storm. She told it a story. One was an act of dominance. The other, an act of understanding. If you're finding this story of forgotten wisdom valuable, and you believe that sometimes the old ways hold a truth we've lost, then take a moment to subscribe to this channel. We explore these kinds of stories every week. And tell me in the comments, what is one piece of old-fashioned advice you've received that turned out to be profoundly true? I'd love to read your stories. Now, let's return to Wyoming as the sky turns a malevolent shade of gray. The storm did not arrive. It materialized. One moment, the sky was a bruised purple, the air unnaturally still. The next, the world was gone, erased by a blinding horizontal wall of white. The temperature plummeted not by degrees, but by tens of degrees in minutes. It was January of 1889, the beginning of the great blizzard that would be spoken of in hushed tones for 100 years. The storm that would be known as the Great White Hurricane. Inside the town, in the sturdy, well-built home of Silas Blackwood, the world was reduced to a primal roar. The wind was not a sound, it was a physical presence. It hammered on the walls, a relentless, concussive assault. The entire house groaned, the timbers crying out like the ribs of a dying beast. Snow, finer than sand, was being driven through invisible cracks around the window frames, accumulating in ghostly white lines on the floor. Blackwood's stove, a magnificent cast-iron behemoth that was the pride of his home, was devouring wood at an astonishing rate. He and his son fed it constantly, yet its heat seemed to vanish inches from its surface. The stovepipe glowed a dull cherry red, a testament to the sheer volume of heat being sucked up the chimney by the gale screaming over the roof. The far corners of the main room were already rimed with frost. His wife and daughter were huddled together under a mountain of blankets, their faces pale. This was his fortress. This was his monument to logic and strength. And it was failing. The cold intended to kill, and it was finding its way in. Outside, drifts were forming with terrifying speed. The snow, driven by the vacuum on the lee side of his house, was already halfway up the back door. By morning, they would be sealed in. The roar of the wind was a constant, maddening scream, a sound that frayed the nerves and stripped away all thought of anything but survival. 20 miles away, in a small clearing surrounded by young trees, the world was different. Outside Alara's cabin, the blizzard raged with the same demonic fury. But it was distant. The sound was not a ground-shaking roar, but a high, thin shriek, like a hawk circling far overhead. It was the sound of the storm passing over her. Inside the embrace of her living wall, the air was almost still. Snow fell, yes, but it fell softly, vertically, as if in a gentle forest. It was already accumulating on the dense branches of the spruce trees, beginning to form the great, insulating dome her father had described. The space between the trees and her cabin, the stiller Raum, remained a sanctuary of relative calm. Her cabin was tiny, barely one room. Her stove was a small, simple thing, a fraction of the size of Blackwood's monster. But it was enough. With the wind lifted away, the heat it produced was not being stolen. It radiated into the small space, filling it with a deep, steady warmth. There were no drafts. The air was still and quiet. The only sounds were the gentle crackle of the fire and the soft hiss of the falling snow. She was not just surviving, she was living. She had spent the afternoon baking bread. The warm, yeasty smell filled the cabin, a scent of life and normalcy in the heart of the apocalypse. She sat at her small table, mending a tear in her father's coat, the light from her lantern casting a steady, golden glow. She was warm. She was safe. She had enough fuel for a week, maybe more, because her tiny stove was so efficient. She had food. She had shelter. Her father's madness, her folly, had worked. It had worked perfectly. While the town that had cast her out was fighting a desperate, losing battle for survival, Elara Vance drank hot tea and listened to the storm sing its harmless song high above her head. For 3 days the white hurricane raged. In the town, it was a time of terror. Families huddled together in single rooms, burning furniture to stay alive. The sound of the wind was a constant torment. Several roofs were damaged, windows were broken. The snow piled in drifts that buried homes to their eaves. When the storm finally broke, the silence it left behind was as shocking as the noise had been. The world was remade in white. The sun shone on a landscape of impossible, sculpted drifts, some as high as the houses themselves. The town was crippled, entombed. It took a full day for the men to begin digging out, to check on their neighbors. The news that filtered through the snow tunnels was grim. Livestock frozen in the fields. 2 prospectors caught in the open, their bodies not found for weeks. Old Man Hemlock, dead in his bed, the fire in his stove having gone out in the night. Silas Blackwood's house had survived, but his pride had not. He had been cold. He had been afraid. His fortress had been breached. And through the haze of exhaustion and relief, a single, horrifying thought began to burn in his mind. The girl, Elara Vance. He had condemned her. He had publicly declared her shelter a death trap. He had envisioned her buried, frozen, a tragic testament to her own foolishness. Now, a grim sense of duty, mixed with a dawning, terrifying curiosity, settled upon him. He had to know. He had to see the result of her madness for himself. He gathered 2 of his toughest men. The journey was a nightmare. There were no roads, only a chaotic sea of snow. They used snowshoes, their progress agonizingly slow. The 20-mile journey took them the better part of 2 days. They expected to find nothing but a mound of snow, perhaps a piece of the roof sticking out like a forlorn grave marker. They were on a recovery mission, a somber duty to retrieve a body. As they crested the final ridge overlooking the parcel of land, they stopped dead. They stared, unable to process what they were seeing. Below them was not a buried shack. They saw a vast, perfectly formed dome of snow, 30 feet high and 100 feet across. It glowed in the afternoon sun, a pristine white hill where none should be. It was utterly silent, and rising from the very center of the dome was a thin, almost lazy plume of gray smoke, ascending straight up into the still, cold air. Blackwood's mind reeled. It didn't make sense. The smoke, it meant a fire. It meant life. Driven by an urgency he couldn't name, he plunged down the slope, his men following, their faces etched with the same bewildered awe. As they got closer, the true nature of the scene revealed itself. The dome wasn't solid snow. Its surface was the snow-laden tops of hundreds of young trees, their branches so heavily burdened they had bent and merged into a single, seamless structure. And leading into the heart of this strange white fortress was a clear, shoveled path, a path that started at the cabin door. He stepped past the outer ring of trees and the world changed. The faint breeze that had been chapping his face died completely. The air temperature rose by several noticeable degrees. It was like stepping from a harsh wilderness into a sheltered garden. The silence was absolute. He could hear the crunch of his own boots, the sound of his own breathing. He followed the path to the small, leaning shack that stood, impossibly, untouched in the center of the clearing. It was not buried. There was barely a foot of snow on its roof. He stood before the door, his heart pounding. He was a man who had built his life on certainty, and that foundation had just been shattered. He raised a trembling, gloved hand and knocked. The door opened. Alara Vance stood there. She was not pale or frostbitten. Her cheeks were flushed with warmth. She wore a simple dress, no heavy coat. Behind her, he could see the cozy, lamp-lit interior of the cabin, and from that open door washed a wave of impossible warmth, thick with the smell of baking bread and wood smoke. She looked at him, and at the two exhausted, half-frozen men behind him, and her eyes held no triumph, no malice, no "I told you so." They held only a quiet, empathetic understanding. Silas Blackwood, the master builder, the voice of reason, the man who knew how the world worked, stood stripped of all his certainty. He looked at the impossible sanctuary she had built, at the warmth pouring from her doorway, at the quiet strength in her face. He opened his mouth, but the grand speeches, the apologies, the questions, all died in his throat. Only a single broken word emerged, a whisper of awe and surrender. How? Alara looked past him at the great white dome of snow and trees that had been her salvation. She thought of her father's words, of the reef and the dam. "You build your walls to shout at the storm, Mr. Blackwood," she said, her voice soft. "My father taught me to build a wall that tells the storm a story. It seems the storm preferred the story." She stepped back from the door, holding it open wide. "You look frozen," she said. "Come in. There's soup." That act of simple, unconditional generosity was the final blow to his pride. He and his men stumbled into the warmth of the tiny cabin, and as Alara Vance ladled hot soup into bowls for the men who had condemned her, the old world of rigid certainty died, and a new world of quiet, profound wisdom began. Silas Blackwood became her first student. He did not just accept her knowledge, he became its most ardent evangelist. He returned to town a changed man. He spoke not of the mad girl, but of the Vance method. He used his own resources, his mill, his men, to help other settlers transplant trees, to build the living walls her father had designed. At first, they were skeptical, but Blackwood's conversion was so total, so zealous, that they listened. He would take them out to her cabin, show them the sanctuary within the trees. He would have them stand inside the ring and feel the wind die, feel the air warm. He would explain the physics of it, using her father's metaphors of reefs and dams, stories and shouts. Slowly, the landscape of the territory began to change. Around the stark, lonely homesteads, green rings of life began to appear. They called them Vance lines, or Elara's groves. The next winter, and the winter after that, no lives were lost to the blizzards. Homes that had once been buried under monstrous drifts now sat in quiet pockets of calm. Fuel consumption dropped by half. The Vance line became the signature of a successful, intelligent homesteader. It became the new wisdom. Elara never sought recognition. She remained in her small cabin, which was now nestled in the heart of a thriving, maturing forest. She became a quiet legend, the mother of the groves. People would bring her gifts, sacks of flour, jars of preserves, a new cast iron pot. They were not gifts of charity, but of deep, abiding respect. She was no longer the liability. She was the unshakable foundation upon which the community's survival had been rebuilt. Years later, an elderly Silas Blackwood stood with his young grandson on the ridge overlooking her land. The scraggly saplings were now a dense, majestic forest. The shack was barely visible, a hint of a roofline deep within the green. The boy was cold and tugged on his grandfather's coat. "It's so windy up here, Grandpa." Blackwood smiled and pointed down into the woods. "It is, but not down there. Down there, it is calm." He pulled a small, worn book from his coat pocket. It was a copy he had made, in his own hand, of her father's journal. He opened it to a marked page. "Your great-grandfather thought he knew everything about building," he told the boy. "He thought a wall had to be made of dead wood. But she taught us all that the strongest walls are the ones that are still alive." He read the passage aloud, his voice raspy with age and memory. "Do not fight the wind. Teach it where to go. Do not curse the snow. Tell it where to rest. Nature is not an enemy to be conquered, but a partner to be understood." What about you? What brutal winds are you trying to fight with a solid wall? What established wisdom in your life is actually a fortress aimed at itself, creating the very problems you're trying to solve? We all inherit these structures, these beliefs that tell us to be stronger, to push harder, to build thicker walls against the challenges of our lives. We are told to dominate our circumstances. But what if there is a forgotten journal waiting for you? A piece of ancestral knowledge, or a quiet, intuitive truth you've been ignoring, that offers a different way? A way that doesn't fight, but understands. A way that doesn't build a dam, but a reef. What part of nature, your own nature included, are you treating as an enemy when it could be your greatest ally? Your trees are waiting. The saplings of a new, more resilient way of living are there, in the foothills of your own understanding. Your forgotten knowledge is the key. Start clearing the entrance to your own quiet room. This story is a historically inspired reconstruction. The characters are fictional, created to illustrate the narrative's central theme. The events are inspired by the challenges faced by pioneers and the principles of environmental design. This content is for inspirational and educational purposes only and does not constitute professional engineering, architectural, or survival advice.